This is the lab video for Module 9 from course 10981. In this video we'll actually be looking at creation of virtual machines using profiles, templates and service templates. So we'll start off by creating the profile objects. We'll then look at bringing those profile objects together to make virtual machine templates and service templates. We'll then actually look at importing and deploying a predefined service template. So first of all, as we've done in a number of these videos, we'll just go across and look at a sample script. So this script here is showing us how we would be able to create a profile from the command line. So effectively the profile defines, or the hardware profile defines, the hardware characteristics of a virtual machine. So let's look at how we would create that inside Virtual Machine Manager. So inside the Virtual Machine Manager console, and we'll start off by going down to the library where all the profile objects are stored. So we can see the profile object on the left, and we can select hardware profile. So either by right clicking or going to the create tool at the top, we can choose to create a new hardware profile. So we'll hit create hardware profile, and we get a page which allows us to give the profile a name and a description. So you might decide to create profiles to represent sort of different sizes of computer or different capabilities. So if we go to the hardware profile, most of the settings in here are pretty standard: processor, memory, network adapters. One of the key things is they don't actually define the disks other than optical media, just because obviously when you build the virtual machine, the disks that a virtual machine have are defined at that point. So here we're actually going off and defining some network configuration, and one of the things that becomes quite important to remember with templates, when we start to use them, you can get the system to allocate IP addresses from the IP pools that are created as part of the network configuration. So we're defining our network classification. So medium bandwidth is going to affect the network throughput by applying quota limits, and we're just applying availability settings again for our environment, so we can deploy these to Hyper-V hosts that are in a cluster. So creating a hardware profile is a very simple object indeed. Next we're going to create a guest operating system profile. So if you remember from previous exercises, we just saw the XML, the unattended answer file that we created. So here we've now got a script which will go and create an OS profile. So this will define the domain you're going to join, it will define the operating system type, features that you might want to install, but it also can supply the answer file that we created before. So you'll see on about the fourth line down, the answer file actually being supplied as a variable there. So we'll drop back to Virtual Machine Manager, and we'll now create the guest OS profile. So again, we'll give it a name. So we'll just do a Contoso server. So what we're going to use for building file servers in the template name. Obviously we can put a description in as well. In the compatibility, you can choose whether you're personalizing Windows or Linux. In the guest OS profile, obviously we can choose the operating system. This can affect certain features, so we'll put 2012 R2. Identity can also be used to name the machine. The administrator password defines where the local administrator password comes from, whether you want a blank one, whether you want to actually define it in the template, or you could use a run as account. Again, you have elements like product key, which can be supplied, and time zone information. When you look at identity for the computer name, it's also important to realize that you can use hashes in there to generate numerical values, so effectively incremental numbers 00, 01, 02 and so on. Because we're using Windows Server 2008 R2 or above, this also allows us to actually deploy additional roles and features as part of the deployment when using service templates. So here you can see we can actually add some additional file server capabilities without having to actually put them into the actual virtual file, like we did in the previous module when we actually went and added IIS. You can actually see we could have done that here, providing we actually deployed using service templates. One of the key things that's important to remember here though is anything that becomes a sort of an optional addition, for example like installing the management tools, you'd need to make sure that you add. We can supply the parameters that are going to be needed for domain join. So here I'll specify the domain name and again credentials for being able to join that domain. And again you can see we've got the answer file option down the bottom. So we can specify the answer file as we saw in the script file just now. So we can actually go and pick the answer file from our library, which can also go off and do additional customizations if we want to. One of the things that just get prompted for there is if there's actually values in the answer file which we can configure through the graphical user interface. Do you want it to pull those settings out and add them into the graphical interface? So we'll just say no to that. So we now have our guest OS profile. Okay, so having created the guest OS profile, we'll now go off and look at creating an application profile. So we're going to create an application profile, as we can see from the script, called Contoso Monitoring Tools. Again, in the script we can see we're identifying the operating system this is going to be deployed to, and we're then actually going to use this to go and deploy an application by basically running a script file. So we're actually going to go and deploy the operations manager agent basically by running the sort of setup MSI that we actually get with the product. So we'll go to the create application profile. We're just going to give the application profile the name we saw in the script, so the Contoso monitoring tools name. Again, if we wanted to supply a description and so on, we could do that here. You'll see there's a compatibility that just actually acts as a filter for later on in the wizard. So we're just going to leave it set to general because then it'll present every single option to us. So here's the first page where we actually get to pick the operating system. So we'll just go and pick Windows Server 2012 R2 Data Center, and then using the add button at the top left we'll then be able to add the type of application. So we're going to do script application because we're going to basically get it to run a script that we want it to execute. So we can define a name. This can be any name that we want. So in the script that we saw just now it said operations manager agent. We then get to specify the executable parameter, the executable program that we want to run. So because it's actually an MSI file, we're actually going to run the MSI exec. So windir system32 /MSI exec.exe. And then the parameters are going to be the parameters that we need to run on the MSI exec. So /I allows us to identify the MSI itself, so mom agent.msi. We then got the /qn, so basically we want to run it as a quiet installation, so make it sort of as without any interaction. We then use the browse button to select the package that's already been put into the library, so the ops manager agent.cr. So that completes the configuration for that particular object, with the exception of actually supplying the credentials. Now obviously the credentials need to obviously have the ability to install software, so need to be quite powerful credentials. So that would define the monitoring tools installation. So we can actually see, if we just go into the folder where we actually have the ops manager agent CR, we can actually see the mom agent.msi in there that we're actually going to execute. So that's all that's actually in that folder. So that completes the configuration of the application profiles. Obviously application profiles can be used for deploying web packages, server app v and other bits and pieces as well. So here we've now got a script that's going to go and build our virtual machine templates. So virtual machine templates can actually contain hardware configuration, but they can also contain applications for customizing the operating system as well. So we're just going to actually go and build our virtual machine template and bring in some of the values that we've used. So as we've seen before, going through the virtual machine template wizard in the previous lab, you can base it on some pre-existing object. So we're just going to take a VHD that we've actually already got. So we'll just take one of the VHDs, okay, make sure we get the correct one from the correct library server. So this is just an operating system which has been sysprepped. We'll then give the template a name, and as we saw in the script we'll use the same name, so we'll actually name it as the Contoso development file server. So I'll be creating this for the development team. We can then go and configure the hardware. So when we've been using this before, we've actually gone through and set all the values, so you can see straight away I've been able to pull those profile values in. So it makes it much easier, more t-shirt sizing to be able to set those types of values. So rather than actually have to add them in. Interestingly, there is a save as button there, so if you did actually go and set the values individually, you can then turn that into a hardware profile straight from this user interface as well. So again, on the configure operating system, we're going to pull in the configuration settings from before, and also from the application configuration we're going to pull in those settings as well. You can see the last page is for SQL configuration. Obviously we didn't create any SQL profiles. Now one thing that's a little bit misleading in this interface is, even though we created a template, okay, we can't use that template and all of its settings to build a machine directly as a template. Okay, you do need to bring the template into a service template to be able to use it fully. Okay, so we've got a script here where we're actually just again going to actually go and provision a virtual machine from that template that we've just created. So if we just close down those windows and go back to Virtual Machine Manager and actually build the virtual machine. Okay, so in Virtual Machine Manager we're going to select the template that we've just created, and we're going to create a virtual machine. So notice we get a pop-up warning us that the Windows Server roles and features and the application deployment won't work. They only work when used with service templates, and we'll get to service templates shortly. So obviously here we give the virtual machine a name. Okay, notice I can press the next button without entering a name. If you do actually press the next button without entering a name, it will base the name on the template name. But obviously I can just press enter next. Notice that all of the settings have been picked up that we've entered as part of the template that we're actually using. So again, all of the configure operating system values are set. We can then choose where we'd like to deploy it. So it's for Contoso, so we're going to deploy it hopefully into the Contoso cloud. So again, we'll press next, and then we've just got a few summary settings. So we'll see what we've got when we get to the page. So here again we have this opportunity to override the name. So you can notice the name going to be the LUN-FS01, which is obviously defined in the template. So just looking at the same sort of startup and shutdown properties as always, we can obviously go and review those settings and change them if we feel that we need to. Okay, so we're just going to configure, always start this virtual machine and put a delay. So if the Hyper-V host boots, then just delay starting this machine, don't start it straight away. So as we can see, the job's now running and it's going to start provisioning the virtual machine. So this will obviously take a few minutes, as these jobs always do, due to the copying the file and other steps that it needs to perform. So what we can have a look at is actually doing this from the command line using a few PowerShell commands. So we'll open a Virtual Machine Manager PowerShell prompt, and we'll actually start building the virtual machine. So having built all of the virtual machine templates, it actually becomes very easy then to build machines from the command line, unlike if you're building all the components individually, which make it much harder. So we're literally just going to use the $template equals, and then we're going to do scvm template, and we're going to specify the name of the template. So obviously our template was called Contoso dev file server. So Contoso dev file servers. It's not case sensitive, but I'll just go and change the C just to make it look tidy. And then we're going to do a new -sc virtual machine, and then we'll get it just to use the template. So first of all, we'll specify the name we would like the virtual machine to have, so LUN-FS02, and then VM template, and we'll specify the template name. So just $template, because obviously the get template has set that value for us. The last bit is obviously going to be to define where we'd like the template to be stored. So we're going to specify a location for actually storing the template. The run asynchronously command, okay, allows us to actually ensure that we get the command prompt back. It doesn't wait until the command finishes before the prompt comes back. So the last bit it does ask us for is actually the host that we want to provision on. Now it is possible that you can get the system to go through the auto sizing rules, but we're going to tell it which host we want to provision on. So you can now see, having run the PowerShell command, that has created the second job. So obviously the first job with 78%, obviously the one we fired off initially. We then have the second virtual machine. Now interestingly, just to note, because we provision to a host, the descriptive text, the names for the jobs are different. So the first job we actually provision to the Contoso cloud, the second one we provision directly to a host. So you can actually see slight different names in the jobs. So these will take a little while to complete. So we'll come back once they're finished. So as we can see, the first virtual machine creation job, created the virtual machine in the cloud, is just coming to an end, and the second virtual machine creation is not far behind. So as the creation of the second virtual machine comes to an end, let's go across to the actual virtual machines themselves and just see what's happening. So if we actually go to the first virtual machine that we created, and we'll actually just connect to that virtual machine. So go to machine number 1. We can see that it's got sign into Contoso at the bottom. You can see actually where the way the screen fits. It's picked up the answer file screen resolution that we configured in one of the previous lab exercises. So we can see that experience has all been imposed. So we've got the domain join, we've got the screen resolution experience. So we can see that operating system personalization has actually had an effect on this particular virtual machine. So switching back to Virtual Machine Manager, so we're just waiting for that last virtual machine to complete. So I'll actually be going through its various sort of personalization phases to install roles and features, join the domain, all those bits and pieces. So we should be pretty close to that completing and being able to connect to that machine and see the same personalizations have happened. So we'll just shut down the first machine. Just going to turn it off because obviously we're not going to use it for anything else. We're just going to delete the virtual machine. So as it seems taking a little while for that machine just to finish off, let's go across to service templates and actually look at how we would create a service template. So from the library section, we choose the create service template tool. You give the service template a name, a version, and you then define the template type. So a single machine, a 2-tier solution, or a 3-tier solution, as well as a blank are available in the templates. Remember, it's the machine tiers represent the machine types, not the number of VMs that you want to create. Okay, so the actual single machine is one type of VM. The 2 tier is 2 different VMs, like a web front end and a SQL backend. You might actually create multiple instances of them if you want to enable features like auto scaling. So we've got our single tier. Over on the left hand side you can see we've got the template, so I can just literally drag that template across, which actually will go and configure the service tier for me with all of those settings. And the great thing about service templates is it actually takes advantage of the roles and features, the application installs. So all the bits that wouldn't have happened with the virtual machine, like the application installation for the operations manager agent, wouldn't have happened with the 2 machines we've just built, but it will happen for these because it's a service template. So the key thing is when we deploy the service template, you won't see that warning we got when we did the virtual machine template telling us that the roles and features and the application settings can't be applied. So if we select the service template, we're just going to go back into the designer and make a couple more changes. So first of all, we're going to go to the object so we can go and actually change the name. So we're going to open up the properties of the virtual machine instances, and you can see that it's got this Contoso dev file servers -machine tier 1. So the first part of the name has come from the template. The second part of the name, the machine tier 1, is come from the service engine itself. So we're just going to change that to file server tier. So pretty minor change there, so we'll just save those settings back. Also on that page you would notice that you have the options there. If it was something like a web, we could choose to auto scale the service if you want. So the key thing is you can see that you can edit templates quite easily. Obviously one thing to bear in mind is service templates stay connected to deployments. So if you've actually deployed a service template, you can no longer edit that template, but what you can do is create a new version of the template if you want to. So here we're just going to jump into a bit of PowerShell, and again we're just going across to the scripts folder that we've been using quite a lot. So we're going to go into the scripts for module 9. But before we run the script, let's just have a quick look at what the script's going to do. Things I mentioned quickly was the fact that you could configure templates to deploy multiple instances of a virtual machine. So we can actually see this is going to configure the service template to actually change the default instance count, the instance minimum count, the instance maximum count. So actually we're going to use this to change configuration parameters of the service tier that we've actually created. So if we just go, and before we run the script, let's just go back into the template. Just in case you missed it before, we can have a quick look at the values on the front page. You can see this tier can be scaled out, it's not ticked, and all the values are set to 1. So if we go back to the PowerShell prompt, hopefully with a bit of luck what we can do is we can actually go and run the PowerShell command. So we'll go and run that script for the set service scaleout.ps1. So press enter, and hopefully that will go and make the changes to the service template that we wanted. So hopefully if we go back into the designer, if we now actually look at the service template, you can see on the top level those numbers are there, but you can now see the box is ticked and the box doesn't have all ones in it. We've got a 2 4 2 2, so default of 2, maximum of 4, minimum count of 2, and so on. So you can see again we can edit and customize service templates from the command line. So that can be quite easy again in self-service scenarios where you can actually give people an option whether they wanted to scale their application or not, and you could then use the PowerShell obviously to change the configuration of that deployment quite easily. So one of the other things that's really good about service templates is actually they're quite mobile, so you can easily develop them on a test development system and then you can import them onto your production, or again you can use them to get service templates from other locations. So for example, Microsoft do provide service templates for deploying Link, SharePoint, Exchange on one of their blog sites, the Building Clouds blog, if you've not come across it. So we've actually got one for something called the Service Provider Foundation. So the Service Provider Foundation is part of the Windows Azure pack. So what we're actually going to do here is import the template using the import template button on the ribbon. Okay, and it then lists all the things that it's going to go and create. So the key thing here is you'll see there are objects on the left hand side which are the resource names and effectively where they're going to be read from in terms of which objects they're going to map to inside the library. So one of the key things is you can see that entry at the bottom which actually got the sort of warning triangle with none. So really what the system's saying is I don't know what object to match that to or to create inside Virtual Machine Manager. So that's really the VHD file. So we're actually going to say, oh, you want to match it to this VHD file. So you've got to obviously have a VHD file which has the correct values in it. So in our case the template needs a Windows Server 2012 R2 VHD file and that's been sysprepped. So we've obviously got a VHD file that meets that requirements. So the last step is then effectively just to define where you want to save this service template to. So that's going to be a lot of the additional configuration elements, and the key thing is elements like custom resources that would need to be created. So depending obviously how big a service template is will very much depend on obviously how long the import package wizard actually goes and takes to create the elements in the database and potentially connect to some objects and even create some objects inside the library share. So we'll come back once this is finished in a moment or two. So we've now saved the or imported the package. Okay. So we're now going to import a second one. So those that are familiar with the Windows Azure pack, there's effectively two components. There's something called the Service Provider Foundation which we've imported. We're now actually going to import the Azure pack, and again we've really got to do the same mapping. We've got to identify our Windows Server 2012 with which has been sysprepped. So we've just made that mapping, and we're now actually again just going to select the library server that we're actually going to deploy this service template to. So again, just in case you're unfamiliar with Windows Azure pack, so Windows Azure pack gives us a sort of a Microsoft Azure style experience for delivering platform as a service and infrastructure as a service on premise. So private cloud solution on premise. And it's made up of these two pieces. The Windows Azure pack's the web front end, the bit you interact with. The Service Provider Foundation is the bit that sort of links the website to System Center to be able to drive the underlying infrastructure. So we've actually just gone off and we've built that infrastructure. Okay, so what we're now going to do is we're now actually going to get the system to go and use those templates for the purpose of deploying our build. So we just want to change the configuration of the cluster. One of the things that Virtual Machine Manager does by default is it makes sure you've got enough spare resource in a cluster so it won't over provision it. So we've just had to take that safety feature off so that we've got enough resources to provision our virtual machines. So the first thing we're going to do is provision the service provider foundation. So we've actually selected the service provider foundation service template. We've actually said we want to configure deployment, and we've selected the Contoso production cloud that we want to provision into. So hopefully this will bring up the designer window. So this will allow us to confirm that we've got enough resources to provision the service provider foundation. So we'll just refresh the deployment, and hopefully you'll see the warning triangle goes against the one server and it all seems to be okay. You'll also see in the bottom left hand corner we've also got some parameters that we need to supply. So we just need to go and enter passwords and a couple of other bits and pieces. Now one of the key things here is deliberately within the labs it's been configured so that we're not going to encrypt those values, so you can see what's being typed in and so on. However, you could, if you wanted to, make those values encrypted so you'll only see dots as people actually type in this case, passwords. So hopefully we'll just do a refresh deployment, and that will just make sure that we've covered all of the requirements and we get no warning triangles or error messages anywhere. So we'll hit the deploy service, and that will actually start the deployment process for this particular service. So this is going to go and build that one virtual machine, and it's going to go and install that service provider framework. So this is a job that's going to take quite a bit of time, because not only are we going to deploy the virtual machine, configure the virtual machine, join it to the domain and all those bits and pieces, there's then going to be some application installs that are going to occur afterwards. So this will take quite a substantial amount of time. For those that have never really deployed service templates, one of the things that becomes quite frustrating when you do these is actually the progress bar. You think you're getting quite close to the end, and then the progress bar shrinks right back again as we move into different phases, because the job evolves as we actually progress through the changes. It doesn't have every single step in it at this precise moment. It's as we move from one phase to the next does the actual individual tasks and steps change, and therefore the progress bar can go down as well as up. So we're going to have to wait for this to complete. Okay, so the service provider foundation is well underway now, so it should be far enough ahead that we can go and start the Windows Azure pack. So we're going to go through basically exactly the same process again. So I'm going to name this the Windows Azure pack, obviously deploy to the same Contoso production cloud. So that's going to again fire up the deploy service tool. So again we're just going to hit a refresh to make sure we meet the sizing requirements. So again hopefully the warning triangle will disappear. There we go. If we had to supply any parameters, you can see again we've got the parameter fields on the left hand side. They all have default values that we can use. So in this instance, all we need to do is just press the deploy service. So we press the deploy service button, and just like with the service provider foundation, this would now have created a job, and we'll start deploying the virtual machine for this job. So it's definitely going to take quite a while now for both of these tasks to complete, so we'll come back at the end. As we can now see, the jobs are almost coming to an end. There we go, just completed. Obviously if you missed it, wasn't watching it, you can obviously go and review the jobs interface to confirm the jobs have completed successfully. So one of the things you will be aware of is that obviously service templates can take quite a while to deploy. So chances are it's not going to be the top jobs in the history. So obviously using the search tool becomes a much easier way to try and find the jobs you're after. So we can see just by using create service, you can see I can see the Windows Azure pack and the service provider foundation jobs in the list. So we can see they've completed successfully, and if I wanted to, I could obviously select those jobs and I could review the status of what happened for each of those jobs and make sure that all the steps that I wanted to be deployed and completed have been deployed and completed successfully. Also, if there was an error message, hopefully I'd be able to get some insight into what that error message was and be able to take remediation actions. And the final thing is obviously we can see the two virtual machines running, and we'll look at the Azure pack later. So that brings us to the video recording for the Module 9 lab to an end. So we saw how to create profiles, virtual machine templates, service templates, then we imported the Windows Azure Pack templates and deployed those.